Hi class, this is Professor Barry Brennan. This is for my argumentation class, and we are going to talk about the fundamental concepts in argumentation. I'm going to go straight to that PowerPoint. I hope you're having a good day today. Okay, here we are. So when we talk about fundamental concepts, what we're really talking about are particular terminology and ways of thinking about argumentation. Argumentation belongs to the discipline of communication, and it is a form of communication, and we're going to look at, as we study it and understanding it, and what I want you to start doing is thinking in terms of how you're going to talk about arguments. Right? These terms are important. It's like if you were taking, when you take a biology class, you have to learn there's certain terms, right? The cell nucleus, DNA, RNA. You need to know all those things, right? In order to explain what you're talking about. So in argumentation, it's the same idea. You're going to need to learn how to discuss an argument in terms of, we talk about it in terms of stock issues, or we're talking a prima facie case, or it depends on what we're talking about, but let's try to stick to learning how to use those particular terms. The same way I taught you about, terms in communication. So presumption is what we call one approach. It's the idea that we should stay with what we know or know until someone can prove otherwise. What we do or know. Okay, that's basically the status quo. So if you're on, we talked about debate, affirmative and negative. The affirmative is you're affirming whatever that preposition is, or that position is. That proposition, not preposition. That proposition is. We're affirming the position. Okay, that's the status quo. The status quo is whatever's happening right now. So it's kind of, I always think of like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Think of, when you think about government in general, the government is bureaucratic and it's basically made to create change in a slow way. If government has that purpose, right? And it has that purpose for a reason. And it's so that as change is made slowly over time, people have the opportunity to also interrogate it or investigate it or argue with it, basically. And that as people, we're always seeking balance. When we're young, we like change, generally speaking. Okay, maybe there's some of you out there that don't like change, but a lot of times when you're young, you like change and you can go with it. We're resilient. But the older we get, I think it's because we get tired too. But the older we get, the more we like things that we can expect, right? Because we did all that change, or that we just don't want to work that hard. That's the status quo. It's not a bad thing. Status quo has a purpose, right? When you're a kid, you want your parents to have a home, your parents or guardians to have a home where you know what to expect. We like that. So sometimes the status quo gets a bad rap because we think, oh, that's a status quo, but it has a purpose. Now, there are a lot of bad things about the status quo, like white supremacy, bad thing about the status quo. Racism, bad thing about the status quo. We're working as a society, probably not hard enough, but working to change that. So the status quo refers to the current situation, what is accepted practice, or the idea right now. Okay? What is that should be accepted, and I have to fix that. What is the accepted practice or idea that we currently believe in? Richard Whately, in his book, The Elements of Rhetoric, he said, presumption is more cautious. It's more conservative in nature. And I think I've already established that, right? So when we get older, generally speaking, we get more conservative in the way we approach things. There's a lot of reasons why. Not just because we don't want change, because we're lazy and because we're old. It's because we've lived a life and we have a broader view. Okay? The longer years you have on the planet, even if you haven't right? We think that someone has a broader view if they've traveled everywhere. That's not necessarily true. You can be a person that lived in the same community and you still have a broader view because you have life experience. And you have a way of seeing, and you've gone through trials and tribulations and different experiences, and you've lost things and gained things, and you have a certain wisdom. So there's nothing, again, that's that status quo. To look at it from a point of view, because I used to always think, let's go against the status quo, we don't like it, but there's something behind it. So it is more conservative in nature. So there is a presumption in favor of traditional values and beliefs. So traditions become traditions because they're repeated. That's how you make a tradition. It's not that hard to even figure out, right? It's a repeated practice over time. It becomes a tradition when everyone knows that's what you do. Okay, it's accepted. You can create a tradition in your family. You can create a tradition, in your community. There's a presumption in favor of majority opinion. And there's a presumption in favor of existing institutions. So that's basically how we can understand status quo. It's a presumption in favor of traditional values and beliefs. It's a presumption in favor of majority opinion. And it is a presumption in favor of existing institutions. So majority opinion, institution, traditional beliefs all act in favor of the status quo. All right, we all got that? Understanding what the status quo is? Cool. Let's move on. Okay. So in order to change the status quo, now I've already established the status quo is pretty solid, right? We're talking institutions, we're talking traditions that have been practiced over time. We're talking about the majority opinion, so most people hold this opinion. You want to change that? I want you to think about that. This is what happens in argumentation. Is it you have the person that's trying to change that bears the burden of proof. You have to prove that that's no longer working, that that's not good enough, that goes against our moral fiber as a community, as a nation, right? You have the burden of proof is on you. I want you to think about the best way, if those of you that watch law shows like Law and Order or cop shows where they have trials or any of that stuff, if you like any of that stuff, I like it because it's black and white. We know who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and it usually not always ends up the good guy winning, but it's really cut and dry, right? Well, the affirmative, which is the prosecution, now I said the affirmative, it depends on what you're arguing, but the affirmative, if you're arguing against the status quo, then the prosecution has the burden of proof against the defense. They have to prove that someone did something because the defense has that claim of people are innocent. That's what we believe in our country. People are innocent until proven guilty. That's like the status quo. Okay, is it starting to make sense of how you want to look at this? Let's look at this. In argumentation, the side arguing for change, it's usually the affirmative. So it kind of goes against what I just said, but it's usually affirmative, bears the burden of proof. So think of the affirmative like the prosecutor. The burden of proof is the need to make a convincing case to overcome, remember, what's presumption? It's traditions, traditional traditions of practices, traditions that have to do with practices and beliefs. It has to do with ways institutions behave and their rules and the way they go about doing things. And it has to do with majority opinion. So the burden of proof has to overcome those things. It's not easy being on the affirmative side. Prima facie case. What do we mean by that? So if you're the affirmative, you want to have a case that's strong enough on its face to require a response from an opponent. Now, all of you watched that TED Talk I'm trying to think of the man's name right now, and it's not coming to me. Stephen Wise, there it is. Stephen Wise, who argued for the Non-Human Rights Project. He argued and gave very interesting evidence for the human rights of the great apes. And he did it in a bunch of different ways, right? If you did your homework, you know what I'm talking about. He did it in a bunch of different ways, not just with his words, but he did it visually as well, which I thought was really interesting. So did he give strong enough on its face to require a response from the opponent? I'm going to say that he did. I'm going to say that just without his arguments, the faces of the apes alone required a response. If you remember in the TED Talk, behind him, the faces of the apes, and they were ever changing, right? But the faces of the apes were there, and they were constantly there. Why? What was that doing for you? Well, my guess is you were seeing yourself in them, because that's what I saw. I saw individuality. That's what we think of as humans. I saw difference between them. Now, you might not know that if you go to the zoo and you look at apes, right? You watch apes. I'm looking at my time over here. You look at apes and you think they all look the same. But this TED Talk really gave you a chance to see the individuality of each individual ape, which that took like the argument to another level, right? What would it mean if they were individual apes? Then the next kind of inductive reasoning is they have individual personalities. If they look different, they probably act different. If they act different, that means they have different personalities. If they have their own individual personality, that means they're probably intelligent, right? So we kind of like this deduction that we go to. So when we say a prima facie case, the evidence presented is compelling enough for presumption to be put in doubt. And that's just what I was talking about. So I just gave you that, right? He comes up with a lot of different examples. He talks about what happened with the slave who I want to say ran away, but that's not the right words I want, but got away from his master, right, in England, and was able to make a case. A case was made for him to be treated like a human being because they didn't agree with slavery and they didn't support that kind of enslavement of peoples. And that he used an example because of the argument that was made. Okay, not to say that slaves are similar to, and maybe a slave is similar to the way apes are enslaved. I could see that. But he used a lot of different arguments. He talked about the intelligence of apes, how they're able to recognize people, how they're able to communicate, their level of intelligence. I mean, he definitely, to me, he brought a lot of evidence, right? And I can hear all the arguments against in my head. Like, what does that mean? Can people then marry apes and different things like that, which is getting off the topic. We're going to stop there because I think I'm running out of time and I keep looking at my time. We're going to stop there and we're going to move on. The next thing we move on to is structuring your argument. Okay, I'll see you in a bit.